Take your dog and get out. My son jabbed his finger toward the front door, while rain hammered against the windows. His wife cradled their baby and looked at me with contempt. You've been a burden long enough. Then my son grabbed my old dog by the collar, dragged him across the hardwood floor, and shoved him out into the storm. I quietly picked up my suitcase, clipped on the leash, and walked out without a word. 48 hours later, a silver-haired lawyer set a document down in front of me. When my son reached the final page, he stumbled backward and whispered, "No, this can't be happening. Welcome back to Wise Revenge, the place where real stories about dignity, family, and hard-won justice find the audience they deserve." Before we go any further, drop a quick word in the comments and let me know, is it morning where you are, afternoon, or are you up late listening while the house is quiet? I always like to know who's keeping me company. One small note before we begin: some details in this story have been shaped for the telling, and any resemblance to specific real people or events is purely coincidental. What's true is the human experience at the heart of it. That part is as real as it gets. A brief note before we begin: this story draws on fictional elements, shaped for both entertainment and reflection. Names and places are invented, but the truths buried inside it are real enough to keep. Rutherford County winters can grind a man down to the bone. I've lowered my wife into the ground with these same two hands. I've pushed through fevers and a screaming back in stretches when every dollar had to stretch twice, counting quarters just to keep food on the table. But across 72 years on this earth, nothing reached in and hit me the way those 5 words did. Take your dog and get out. My Colin's voice. The same boy I'd walked the floors with at 2 in the morning when his ears ached so bad he couldn't settle. The same boy whose entire world had once fit in the bed of my pickup for a 400-mile drive to college. That voice, cold and flat as frozen blacktop, telling me to clear out of the house I'd helped put a roof on. Let me bring you back to that evening. October, Charlotte. The rain wasn't falling so much as driving in sideways, ice-edged, the kind that finds the gap between your collar and your neck before you've even had a chance to button up. I'd been upstairs in my little second-floor room, settled in, with an old Elmore Leonard paperback. Remy stretched across the foot of the bed the way he always did. Remy's my golden retriever, a decade-old muzzle gone silver, not quite as quick on his feet as he once was, but glued to my side like I'm the last fixed point on the map. That night, he grew restless. Started nosing at the door, scratching at the frame. I took it for a nature call and let him into the yard. Should have gone out with him. That was my mistake. 10 minutes, give or take. And Renata's voice came tearing up through the floorboards. Pitched high and sharp, the sort that doesn't need to be loud to slice right through you. Oh my God, Colin. Colin, get in here right now. I was already moving toward the stairs before she got his name out a second time. I rounded the corner into the living room and pulled up short. Remy was just inside the back door, 4 muddy paws planted at the edge of the area rug, tail drawn down between his legs, ears pinned flat. The latch I hadn't secured properly, that was on me. The yard was a swamp. His paws showed every inch of it. That was the sum of the offense. That was it. The whole crime. Renata stood rigid beside the couch, Owen crushed against her chest, like Remy had burst in off the street, breathing fire. Owen was 8 months old, healthy, calm, his little cheek resting sideways on his mother's shoulder, without a care in the world. That animal almost jumped on my baby, Renata said, her voice going ragged at the seams. Renata, he's right there by the door, I said, holding my tone steady. He never got close to Owen. Don't stand there and tell me what he did or didn't do. I was watching. Her jaw was set like a clamp, eyes lit with something past irritation. You want to know what this is? This is every day. Every single day it's the same story, with that dog fur on every cushion, paw prints on the floor, and now this. I got down on one knee and took Remy's paws in my hands, cleaning them off the way I'd done 100 times before. He licked my wrist, just the once still shaking a little from the rain and the fuss. "I'll have the floor cleaned up in 5 minutes," I told her. That's when Colin appeared at the end of the hallway. Still dressed from work slacks, collar button, open glass in hand, with something amber in the bottom of it. His eyes went to the floor, then to Remy, then to Renata. Some wordless thing moved between the two of them. I felt it less in the room than in my sternum. Renata tilted toward him, dropped her voice. Didn't drop it enough. "I can't keep doing this," she said. "Colin, I mean every word of that. I cannot keep doing this." He set the glass down on the entry table without looking at me, reached back and rubbed his neck jaw like he was working up to saying something he'd already decided on and just needed to get past his teeth. "Dad." Flat. Not raised, not sharp flat. And flat, I've learned, is the worst register of all. At least anger tells you the other person is still in there somewhere, still feeling the friction. Flat means they've already left. "I think we need to revisit the living situation." "The living situation," I said back. "This arrangement isn't working anymore." He met my eyes finally. His were rimmed pink with exhaustion. "Renata and I have an infant now. We need room to breathe. This needs to feel like our home." My hand stopped moving on Remy's paws. "I was under the impression it was mine too," I said. Renata made a sound low in her throat, not a laugh, not a scoff, but something harder than either one. "Colin." That one word drop with the specific quiet behind it that tells you everything's already been decided. And what you're watching now is just the formality of it being said out loud. "Go ahead and do what we talked about." He crossed to the hall closet, the sound of hangers moving. He came back out with my old blue suitcase, the one that had held everything I brought with me out of Rutherford County, and placed it on the floor by the front door. Placed it. Not flung it. Set it down like it was a line he'd rehearsed. "Dad, take your dog and get out." Eyes on the floor when he said it. I can't share a roof with a stubborn old man and his dirty animal anymore. The cold those words put in the room was something you could feel on your skin. I got to my feet slowly because my knees don't cooperate in wet weather, never have. I looked at Colin. Not a glance. A long, searching look, hunting for the kid who used to slump against the passenger window on late drives home asleep before we hit the highway, breath leaving little clouds on the glass. He wasn't there. Whatever face that was, it wasn't the one I'd raised. Renata had already moved on, tucking Owen's blanket around him, as though the matter had been settled long before tonight, which I suspect it had. I walked over to the suitcase. My hands were steady. "I need you to hold that detail." 72 years old, standing in a house I helped finance, damp air coming in under the door, and my hands did not shake. I unhooked Remy's leash from the peg near the entrance. "Come on, buddy," I said quietly. He came straight to me, pushed the whole length of himself against my leg, warm, present, solid. There was a moment right there where that dog meant more to me than I'll ever find the right words for. I pushed the front door open, and the rain came at us both, no warning, cold, straight through to the flannel in seconds. Suitcase in one hand, Remy's leash in the other. I walked off that porch without a backwards glance. Behind me, the door shut, no anger in it, just the quiet, conclusive click of the latch finding its seat. I stood on the front walk, the dark and the rain all around me. 72 years old. A suitcase, a leash, maybe $35 in my shirt pocket, and a phone showing 8% battery. Remy leaned into my leg and looked up, rain flattening his gold coattail, moving slow and patient. "I know, boy," I told him, "I know. I had no destination. No plan for how the night was going to resolve itself. What I had standing there in the Charlotte dark was this understanding the story that mattered hadn't begun that night. It reached back much further than that. If you want to make sense of how a father winds up in the rain on the wrong side of his own son's door, you need the whole picture. You need to know where I came from. And it wasn't Charlotte. It wasn't broad, well-lit avenues and houses that announce their own price tag from the curb. I mean Rutherford County, North Carolina. Dirt roads and ridgelines and wood smoke drifting through October air. Country where what a man built with his hands said more about him than anything he could put in a bank. My father was a coal miner. 6 days down in the dark, and he'd surface gray with it head to toe. When the mines started shutting down through the early 80s, they took half the community with them. Grown men who'd spent decades underground came up into the light with nowhere to put their hands. Some turned to the bottle. Some just lowered themselves onto porch steps and watched the tree line like they were waiting for it to explain something. I reached for a chisel. I was 28 when I completed my first serious piece. A rocking chair cut from a red oak I'd brought down myself on our property out back. Dorothy stood on the porch one Saturday afternoon, watching me work the sandpaper over it. Little Colin balanced on her hip, maybe 18 months old at that age, where every object in the world is something to grab. "Eugene Hartwell," she said from the doorframe. "The way you talk to that wood, you'd think it was listening." "Maybe it is," I said. I drew my thumb slowly along the grain, searching out any place I'd left rough. Wood doesn't lie to you. The effort goes in, you can see it. The shortcut goes in, you can see that too. She gave me that laugh of hers, the one that welled up from somewhere deep and rose easy. She said, "No, that's a description of yourself." I glanced up at her. Late afternoon sun was cutting through the pines at a low angle, lighting up the motes of sawdust floating off the chair between us. Dorothy wore that expression I knew so well, tender and melancholy together, like she was reading a page of the future I hadn't reached yet. "You're going to be all right, old man," she said quietly. "And so is this family." I believed her. In those days, I believed whatever Dorothy said. Lord, those years were tight. The kind of tight that teaches you to pull a truck engine apart at midnight because paying a mechanic simply isn't an option. The kind where Dorothy could coax a pot of chicken soup into 3 separate meals and somehow make each one feel like the first. Colin grew up on that soup in a little house perfumed with sawdust and pine resin, and Dorothy's coffee already brewing before the sky turned light. Her lungs were the one thing that was never right. A winter cough, first the stubborn kind that overstays its welcome. Then it bled into every season. The doctor in Rutherfordton reached for words I ended up chasing down at the public library. Chronic, inflammatory, progressive. Damp air in old houses made it worse, he said. The medication she needed wasn't always something we could put our hands on. I said yes to every job that knocked. Cabinet doors, barn hinges, church pews, fence posts. Winters I worked by flashlight. The short days ran out before the orders did, so I'd be at the bench behind the house with my breath clouding in front of me. Colin had a habit of slipping out and planting himself on a corner stool to watch. One night he piped up, "Dad, how come you always smell the wood before you do anything else? 7 years old at most. Pajamas with little dinosaurs on them. Socks with holes in the toes. No 2 pieces are the same," I told him. "Oak carries the smell of rain. Pine is Christmas morning. Cherry is almost sweet, like a promise of something worth having." I broke off a scrap of cherry wood and held it out. "Here, you tell me." He shoved it against his nose and pulled a face of total earnest concentration, the kind only a child's face can manage, like Grandma's kitchen. That one hit me so square, I had to set the chisel down and laugh. "Yeah, son, right on the mark." Those were the moments that carried me through the roughest stretches. Not the overdue bills, not the winters the furnace quit on us. The workshop moments my boy perched on his stool, discovering what a pair of hands can make. When a teacher first used the word gifted, I didn't quite know where to put it. Then Mrs. Stratton, his high school principal, a woman who did not believe in cushioning anything, called me into her office and laid it out plain. "Mr. Hartwell, that boy's mind has no business being buried in a coal county with nothing going for it. He belongs at a university." I pointed the truck toward home and spent the whole drive not really seeing the road. Sat in the workshop afterward, palm moving back and forth across an unfinished tabletop, turning it over in my head. Dorothy found me there after the supper dishes were done. She lowered herself onto the old stool Colin always claimed, and laced her fingers together in her lap. "You already know what you're going to do," she said. "It's a lot of money, Dottie." "It's his life, Eugene." Nothing more needed saying after that. I picked up double shifts from Colin's sophomore year straight through to graduation. Dorothy wrung every cent I brought home until it stretched like taffy. No holiday trips, no new furniture. That same truck hauled us around until the floor rotted out, and I got under it with a welder and fixed it myself. The morning I took Colin up to the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, I lugged 2 bags and a box of books up to his dormitory room. His roommate was already unpacked, some song drifting out of a small speaker on the desk. Colin swept his eyes around the room, cinder block walls, a mattress barely thicker than a sandwich, a window squared up against the quad, and something in his face shifted in a way I will carry with me until I'm in the ground. It swung open like a shutter flung wide on the first mild morning after months of gray. "Dad," he said, and his eyes had this brightness in them. "I'm actually going to do this." "I know you are," I said. I pulled him in one solid embrace, quick the way Hartwell men do it, but every bit of it meant. Then I gathered my keys and walked out to the truck by myself. I didn't turn around to see him getting settled. I stood beside the truck in that parking lot and stared up at the building, hunting for his window. His shadow passed back and forth behind the glass, a young man already reshaping himself into someone I'd only partially recognize. Pastor Dale Ingram, my oldest friend back in Rutherford County, had said to me once, "Eugene, the hardest thing about loving somebody well is knowing when to step aside and let them leave." There in that parking lot, those words finally landed. I climbed in and drove. 4 hours back to Rutherford County alone. The passenger seat was empty the whole way home, and the cab held the scent of cedar I'd tucked into it years before. I dialed up a country station and let the highway unspool beneath me. I was convinced I'd done the right thing. I figured that empty seat was proof the job was finished. I'd planted a tree, tended it, watched it shoot up toward a sky I could barely make out from where I was standing. And I told myself any man ought to be satisfied with that. What I hadn't grasped yet, not even close, was that some trees climb so high they lose the memory of the soil that fed them. The rain had worked its way through my flannel shirt and was cold against my skin. My back ached the way it reliably does when the temperature drops. That dull, grinding pressure that crawls up from the base of the spine like something burning slow. Remy was wedged against my left leg, shaking his soaked fur chilled under my fingers. I went on stroking him all the same, more for my own sake than his, and I'll admit that freely. Maybe $35 in my shirt pocket, a phone showing 8% battery, and nobody obvious to dial. That's when Leonard Carveth surfaced in my mind. Strange the way memory operates when you've got nothing left to distract it. 30 years dissolved, and that man's face was right there, sharp as the afternoon I first watched him roll up to my workshop in a truck that rust alone seemed to be holding in one piece. It was 1994. Leonard Carveth was 35, running a modest furniture outfit from a rented warehouse off Wilkinson Boulevard in Charlotte. He'd put 2 hours on the road to reach me because someone at a trade show had passed along my name. His company was hemorrhaging money, a single rotten contract, a single bad season, and bankruptcy was the next stop on the line. He stepped into my workshop, took in the pieces I had underway, drew his hand along an oak sideboard I'd been nursing along for a week, and said the sentence that told me right away he was worth trusting. "You don't make furniture," he said. "You make things that outlast people." "Most things do," I answered. "People aren't put together as well as they once were." He produced a genuine laugh, nothing polished or performative about it. So we shook on it standing there in the sawdust. 3 weeks I gave that commission. A full dining set table, 8 chairs, a sideboard, all in quarters, on white oak with hand-cut mortise and tenon joints on every drawer. Dorothy was sure I'd gone around the bend, up past 1 and 2 in the morning, hands torn up, eyes half shut from the strain. "Eugene, at this rate, you'll land yourself in a hospital," she said one night from the workshop doorway, standing there in her robe with a cup of coffee in each fist. "I'll sleep once it's finished," I told her. "That's what you always say." She came in, handed over the coffee, and took Colin's stool. "Is this piece different from the others?" I sat with that a moment. "This man needs it to be different, Dottie. Everything he's built is balanced on whatever I pour into this wood." She stayed a while quiet, watching me work over the rim of her mug. Then she set it down and said, "Well then, make it the finest thing that's ever come out of your hands." So I did. Leonard hauled that set to a regional design showcase over in Raleigh. He called me from the hotel lobby phone the next morning, back before a cell phone was something everyone carried everywhere. His voice had a controlled quality to it, like a man gripping something tightly. "Eugene," he said, "I just put my name on a contract worth more than everything I grossed last year, and it's because of that dining set. Because of you." Something warm moved through my chest, and it wasn't pride, not exactly. Pride is loud. This was quieter. The satisfaction of a thing seen all the way through without a shortcut taken. "Don't thank me," I said. "I thank the oak." He laughed once more. "I'm thanking you, you stubborn old man." Leonard and I kept working together after that for years. He handled the selling. I handled the making. Past that first job, we never put a formal contract between us. A handshake was our agreement, and a phone call whenever he had something new in mind. What happened to the pieces once they left my shop was never my business. I built them and I released them. Now here I sat, soaked through on my son's front steps, 30 years gone by. That handshake was about the last solid thing I had left to grip. I fished my phone out of my pocket. Cracked screen in one corner, rain dotting the glass, barely enough light to read by. I scrolled until Leonard's name came up in my contacts. My thumb stopped over it. "Think he still remembers us, buddy?" I asked Remy. Remy swung his head around and licked the rainwater off my wrist. I nearly pressed call. Nearly. My thumb was right there, trembling more from cold than doubt, when a pair of headlights arced across the front of the house. A dark sedan eased up to the curb and rolled to a stop. The engine went quiet. For a beat, there was nothing but the rain, the whisper of wet tires on asphalt, the far-off murmur of Charlotte traffic beyond the tree line. The driver's door swung open. Something moved in my chest. Not quite pain, not quite hope, but that suspended feeling you get on the edge of a change, when the air itself seems to go still. I squinted through the dark and the wet, my old eyes not entirely trustworthy, trying to shape the figure standing by the car. Then the man stepped into the reach of the porch light, and the breath left my body. Silver hair. Broad shoulders still held square despite 65 years of living. A dark canvas jacket beaded with rain. And that face older than memory, the lines cut deeper by time, but the eyes were identical to the ones I remembered. Steady. The eyes of a man who honors what he owes. "Leonard," I said. My voice scraped out low and rough, worn down by the cold, and by everything I hadn't said all evening. He took in the full picture: me on those wet steps, drenched old dog at my side, suitcase sitting at my feet, and nothing in his expression broke. No pity, no performance. He just spoke the plain words a man reaches for when language isn't going to cover it anyway. "Come on, Eugene. You and Remy both." Leonard Carveth had never been one to spend words he didn't need to. He never had been. That was something I'd always valued in him. He bent down and closed his hand around the handle of my suitcase before I'd even thought about reaching for it, then turned and walked toward his car, the way a man walks when the matter is already settled and there's nothing left to discuss. Like he'd come here for exactly this reason and saw no call to explain himself before he was ready. "Leonard," I said, levering myself up off the steps. My knees announced themselves and I swallowed the sound. "You don't have to, Eugene." He said my name like a door being gently shut, not unkind, just closed. "Get in the car." Remy was already trotting toward the passenger side like he'd had a reservation all evening. Animals always know. I've believed that my whole life, and I'll take it with me to the grave. I got in. The heat was already going. Warm air rolled over my face and soaked shirt, and I felt my body give way to something caught between gratitude and shame. 72 years old, riding in another man's car, dripping onto his leather seat, because my own son had left my suitcase by the door. "Nadel called me," Leonard said, pulling away from the curb. His gaze stayed forward on the road. "She saw what happened from across the street. She was visiting her niece 2 houses down." I turned to look at him. Nadel Picard, my neighbor of 30 years back in Rutherford County. The woman who had brought casseroles to my house week after Dorothy passed. Who had put her name on a piece of paper for me without asking a single question. Of course Nadel had been watching. Of course she had. "She had no business calling you this late," I said. The words came out harder than I meant them to, scraped raw from everything I was still working to keep down. "She had every business," Leonard said, "and you know it." I turned toward the window. Charlotte moved past in long smears of light and rain. Gas stations. Late-night diners, neon bleeding color onto the slick pavement. A city carrying on with its business as if nothing at all had happened. As if a 72-year-old man hadn't just been made to feel unwelcome under his own son's roof. Remy rested his chin on my arm from the back seat. I reached back and laid my hand on his head without turning around. Leonard's house in the Dilworth neighborhood was a modest 2-story, older than most of the homes around it, and better constructed than any of them. He'd had the porch woodwork done by a craftsman he trusted me actually 15 years back. I knew the grain pattern on those porch columns the instant the headlights found them. The room he led me to was on the 2nd floor. Small, clean, a quilt folded across the foot of the bed and a water bowl already set out on the floor for Remy. I stared at that water bowl and felt something give way behind my ribs. "You were expecting us," I said. Nadel called ahead. Leonard set my suitcase beside the dresser. "Bathroom's down the hall. Extra toothbrush in the cabinet." He moved toward the door, then stopped and reached inside his jacket. From the breast pocket, he drew out a folded envelope and extended it to me. "I've been looking for the right moment to give you this. Turns out tonight is it." I took it. The paper had weight to it. Good stock, the kind that comes out of law offices and accounting firms. I unfolded it and read the heading, "Deferred Compensation Summary, Eugene Hartwell. Carveth Fine Woodworks." My eyes dropped to the figure at the bottom of the page. The room shifted slightly on its axis. I sat down on the bed because my legs had made their own decision about standing. Leonard. My voice had shrunk to almost nothing. What is this? He took the chair by the window, forearms on his knees, eyes on me, the way they always were, level and straight. Every piece you designed for me across 30 years, Eugene, I paid you exactly what we agreed. But the royalties from the collections that kept moving pieces that ended up in showrooms and hotels and private estates, I kept a separate accounting. Because I knew you'd never think to ask. My throat tightened like a hand closing around it. You should have said something. I tried twice, he said. 2013, you told me you didn't need anything beyond what we'd agreed. 2018, you said the same. He settled back in the chair. So I kept adding to it, because it was yours, Eugene. Every cent belonged to you. I was only holding it until the time came. My hands had begun to shake, not from cold. The paper trembled between my fingers, and I pressed it flat against my knee to still it. 15 years, I said. 15 years. I looked at the number again, looked away, looked back. The kind of money that told me I was not, had never been the hollowed-out old man my son's house had made me feel like tonight. Why? My voice split on that one word, and I let it. Leonard, why would you carry this for me? He was quiet for a moment, not an empty quiet, a working one. Then he said, You know what you did for me in 1994, Eugene? You didn't just build a dining set. You worked yourself half to death for a stranger's dream. You poured everything into something that wasn't yours to care about. And because of that, my company didn't go under. My family had a table to eat at. My kids got their education. He held me with those steady eyes. You never once let me square it with you. So I paid it into that account instead. Year after year, whether you'd have wanted me to or not. The part about the mug and the counter, that was just his voice working through something that had no other outlet. The way a man breathes through pain when making a sound would cost him too much. Eugene. Leonard's voice had gone soft now, the hard edge of the drive behind us. You spent your whole life building things for other people. You built your son's future with your own 2 hands. Tonight you sleep in a warm room. Tomorrow we work out the rest. All right? I nodded. Words weren't something I trusted myself with just then. Leonard stood and moved toward the door. Remy had already coiled himself on the rug at the foot of the bed, chin on his paws, watching us both. One more thing, Leonard said from the doorway. He had the look of a man who'd been carrying a sentence around for a long time and was finally ready to set it down. That money is enough to live on, Eugene, for a good long while, which means whatever comes next with Colin, with the house, with any of it, you won't be coming to it desperate. You understand me. I raised my eyes to his. Something ached in my chest. Grief and gratitude wound so tightly together, I couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. I understand you, I said. He gave a single nod, switched off the light, and left me alone with Remy and the sound of rain against the roof and a piece of paper that was rearranging everything I thought I knew about where I stood. I sat in that dark room for a long time, the document resting on my knee, turning over in my mind the $47,000 I'd handed to my son inside a plain envelope. Thinking about a document Colin had put his name to without bothering to read. Thinking about a house in Myers Park with my money sunk into its foundation, like something buried and forgotten. Something was stirring in me. Not anger, not yet. Something older than anger and quieter. Clarity. I came awake the next morning in Leonard's guest room with Remy's chin propped on the edge of the mattress, his brown eyes fixed on me like he'd been keeping watch all night. Pale light was filtering through the curtains. Somewhere below, coffee was going. And before the ache in my back arrived, before the memory of that front door came back to me, my mind went straight to a morning, 6 months earlier, me standing on a hillside in Rutherford County with a land deed in my hand. Let me take you back there. April 2024. The dogwoods were blooming along the ridge, white flowers against a sky so blue it almost hurt to look at. That small piece of land had been in my family for 2 generations. 3 acres of hardwood forest, a creek threading along the eastern edge, and the stump of a red oak my grandfather had felled before I ever drew breath. I used to go sit on that stump and think. Some of the clearest thinking of my life happened on that stump. Nadelle Picard found me there the morning of the sale. She always seemed to materialize when something important was unfolding. Nadelle had been my neighbor for 30 years, a sharp-eyed woman in her late 60s with silver hair cropped close, and a posture that made plain she'd never once let the world roll over her without rolling back. She came up that hill in her good walking shoes and stood beside me looking out across the tree line. "You sure about this, Eugene?" she asked. I dragged my thumb along the edge of the deed. The paper had gone warm from spending all morning in my shirt pocket. "Colin needs the money, Nadelle. He can't cover the down payment on his own." "I know what Colin needs," she said in that measured tone she kept for moments when she disagreed, but had decided not to come at it directly. "I'm asking if you're sure." I looked out at the creek, catching the morning light between the trees. Dorothy and I had walked that creek every Sunday for 22 years. After she was gone, I walked it on my own. Remy used to wait around in the shallows while I stood on the bank, talking to her like she could still hear me. Maybe she could. I've never settled that question in my mind. "She'd want him to have it," I said. "Dorothy always said everything we built was for him." Nadelle didn't answer right off. She stood there beside me in silence, both of us studying that land, the way you study a person you're saying goodbye to. Then my phone went off. Colin. I picked up on the second ring. "Son." "Dad." "Hey." His voice was brisk and clipped the tone he used when he was planted at his desk. "Just checking in. Everything on track for this morning." Something small and cold passed through my chest at the words "on track," as if this were a business transaction, as if I were a vendor hitting a delivery window. "I'm signing at 10, I said. "Just taking a few minutes up on the hill first." Right. I could hear him tapping something on his desk. "And you'll wire it directly?" "Yeah, to the account you texted me. I'll wire it today." "Perfect." A pause. "Hey, Dad, this means a lot to us. It really does." "I know it does, son." After I hung up, Nadelle looked at me sideways. I felt her looking without needing to see it. I kept my eyes on the creek. "He didn't ask how you were," she said. "He's busy, Nadelle." "He's busy, Eugene." She let it alone. That was Nadelle's particular gift. She knew when to press and when to step back and let a man make his own mistakes in peace. At the notary's office in town, the closing ran about 45 minutes. I signed where they pointed. I surrendered the deed. $47,000 moved into the account Colin had given me, just like that 2 generations of land became a line item on someone else's mortgage application. Before I walked out, I stopped at a small folding table near the window and asked the notary for a sheet of plain paper and a pen. He handed them over without asking why. I wrote it out longhand. Straightforward, the way I'd always kept my workshop records, the date, my name, Colin's name, the amount, $47,000, the purpose, down payment assistance for the property, at Myers Park, Charlotte, North Carolina, and at the bottom, a single line I added, because my father had taught me that a man always writes down what he means to be repaid upon request. I slid it across the table to Colin when he came in to countersign the wire confirmation. He picked it up, glanced at it, and smiled. The way you smile at a child who hands you a drawing. "Dad, this isn't necessary," he said. "Humor an old man," I told him. He signed it quickly. Never read past the first 2 lines. Nadell had followed me to the notary's office in her own car. I hadn't asked her to come. She just appeared the way she always did. When Colin signed the paper and slid it back to me, Nadell quietly lifted the pen and added her name below his. In the witness line, I'd left blank. Colin looked at her. She met him with those steady gray eyes and said, "Seemed like the right thing to do." He laughed it off easily. I folded the paper and tucked it into my shirt pocket right up against my chest. That afternoon, I drove back out to the hill one final time. The land already felt like it belonged to someone else. Nothing had changed about the trees or the creek or the light, but the thread connecting me to it had been cut, and I felt the difference in my bones. I sat on my grandfather's stump a good long while. The creek kept moving. A woodpecker hammered away somewhere in the tree line. Remy lay alongside the stump with his head across my lap, and I rested my hand on his back and let his slow, steady breathing settle me. "Well, Dottie," I said to the air and the dogwoods and whatever might be paying attention, "I hope I'm doing the right thing." The wind shifted through the oak leaves overhead, and I decided to take that as an answer because it was all I was going to get. I drove away without looking back. I told myself it was because looking back makes leaving harder. The truth was, I was afraid that if I looked back, I'd turn the truck around. And Colin needed that money. My son needed that money. That was the only thought I permitted myself for the entire 4-hour drive north to Charlotte. Charlotte in May is the kind of beautiful that makes you trust it too fast. The trees along the boulevard were thick and green. The Myers Park neighborhood carried that quiet, moneyed stillness. And Colin's house, our house, I kept telling myself back then, had a front porch with 2 rocking chairs and a yard that wanted attention. I got to work on that yard the first week. I fixed the loose board on the porch steps. I rehung the gate on the side fence that had been scraping against the concrete every time it swung. I planted pole beans along the south-facing wall because I'd put in a garden every summer since I was 30, and I had no intention of stopping now. Colin came out one morning with a mug of coffee, looked over the bed I'd turned by hand, and said what people say when things are still easy between them. "Dad, you didn't have to do all this." He meant it warmly. "Felt good to use my hands," I told him. "You know I go crazy without a project." He laughed, put his hand on my shoulder. "Well, there's plenty around here if you're looking." Those first weeks had a rhythm I could settle into. Up before anyone else, first pot of coffee made out the door with Remy while the streets were still quiet. Renata was home on maternity leave. Owen had just turned 3 months old, and she was focused on him the way a new mother has every right to be. We weren't close, she and I, but we kept things civil. She thanked me when I put dinner on. I gave her space when the baby was sleeping. Remy was careful around the house. He was a good dog. Always had been. Remy never jumped on the furniture. He never begged at the table, never climbed where he hadn't been invited. Never made a sound without good reason. Even so, Renata kept her eye on him the way you watch something you've already judged. Guilty, not frightened, not hostile, just ready. Waiting for the moment she could point and say there. By June, that moment arrived. "Eugene, I've been reading about pet dander and newborns," she said to me one evening, her words landing while my hands were still in the dishwater. There was a rehearsed quality to it, the tone of someone who'd walked through the conversation alone before bringing it into the room. Apparently, it can cause real trouble for babies under 6 months. I think it would help everyone if Remy slept in your room. He hasn't gone anywhere near the baby, I said, steadying my voice. I know that. It's Owen I'm thinking about. A smile moved briefly across her face and stopped short of her eyes. You see what I mean? I saw. What I saw, I kept to myself. After that week, Remy's world shrank to my bedroom and the thin strip of yard off the back of the kitchen. He took it without complaint, dogs always do, which has always struck me as one of their finer qualities. What he did do was post himself outside my door each morning, still as furniture watching for me the way a creature watches when it needs to confirm it hasn't been abandoned. I haven't forgotten you, I'd tell him. Not ever. But summer kept moving. Colin was coming home later, and when he walked through the door, he wasn't fully there. Thumb-scrolling, eyes down, physically present at the table, but mentally somewhere else entirely. The way a man looks when he's working a problem he can't solve out loud. One Saturday in July, I tried talking to him about a red oak I'd found in the park 2 blocks away. A grand old specimen crown, spread wide as any barn I'd ever seen. Said it put me in mind of the old Rutherford County tree line. He glanced up. "That's great, Dad," he said, and went straight back to his phone. Something seized in my chest. I picked up my fork and said nothing more. August brought Renata's old college friend Gwen for a long weekend. I could hear the two of them moving through the house, Renata narrating the kitchen renovation, the nursery she'd assembled herself, the reading nook tucked into the upstairs landing. Every room delivered in her voice, her sensibility, her choices entirely. Then Gwen asked, "So who's living with you these days?" My father-in-law, Renata told her. There was a small, almost imperceptible shift in how the words came out. "He's here temporarily." I was on the top step of the staircase when she said it. That single word found me the way a splinter does barely anything at first, then working deeper than you'd think something that small could go. Temporarily. I walked back to my room and sat down on the bed's edge. Remy climbed up beside me and laid his chin in my lap, looking up with those steady brown eyes. "It's all right," I told him. "She only means until the dust settles." Remy answered with a sound from deep in his chest. Not a whine exactly, more a quiet difference of opinion. "Don't give me that look," I said. But come evening, I was on my knees at the old blue suitcase I'd hauled up from Rutherford County, what I still call my valise, hunting for a particular piece of paper. It was folded near the bottom, slipped into the inner lining where I stored things that couldn't afford to be lost. I spread it out on the bedspread. Colin's signature, Nadel's signature, the date it was drawn up, the repayment amount, due upon request. I had tucked it in there the morning I arrived in Charlotte, the same way I'd filed every important document in my life, without announcement, without theater, the way a careful man handles his affairs when he's not looking for credit. I refolded it and slid it back. A moment later, Renata's voice came up through the floorboards, low and deliberate. Colin was home by then. I couldn't catch every syllable, but I caught what mattered. This was supposed to be temporary, Colin. And Colin's reply came back quieter, softer at the edges. The way water doesn't fight the stone, it just yields. "I know, Nessa. I know. A little more time is all I'm asking." I stretched out on that bed with Remy's warmth against my ribs and fixed my gaze on the ceiling, turning over the same question: had my son ever described anything in his own life as temporary? I combed back through the years. He hadn't. Not one thing. Only my arrangements got that word. September in Charlotte can't seem to commit. One morning, the air sits thick and soupy, summer still refusing to leave. The next, you walk outside, and autumn has slipped in overnight, brisk and plain-spoken, the way cold weather tends to be. I'd been awake since 5 o'clock. 5 in the morning is my time. It has been for 30 years since the workshop days when the light was best early and the wood didn't wait on anyone's schedule. I'd brewed coffee, poured it into the green mug Colin had brought me back from a work trip 2 years ago, and taken my place at the counter watching Charlotte come alive through the window over the sink. Remy had settled under the kitchen table muzzle on his forepaws, keeping track of me with his eyes the way he does whenever he's concluded I require supervision. Colin's phone lay on the counter next to the toaster. He'd come partway downstairs 20 minutes before, grabbed some water, still half-dressed, and gone back up to finish. The phone stayed behind, face down the way he habitually left it. Then the screen came on. I wasn't trying to see what it said. That's important to me to state plainly. The light jumped up right there beside my coffee cup, and the notification preview appeared before I could do anything about it. A message from Renata addressed to what appeared to be a group conversation. The opening line floated on that screen like something dropped into a still pond. Once Dad sells the land, we'll finally have the down payment. I held my mug suspended handle in my fingers, not drinking. I set it on the counter with great care. Then I picked up the phone. I told myself I was only verifying the thread name, confirming I hadn't misread. Just confirming, and then I stopped negotiating with myself and scrolled to the beginning. The thread ran back to February, 8 months prior, 2 months before Colin had rung me in Rutherfordton, with that warm, familiar voice talking about family, about seeing to me in my old age. What I read between Colin and Renata had the structure of a business proposal. Efficient, unsentimental. Colin, once Dad sells the land, we'll finally have the down payment. Renata, how long is a while, Colin? Until we get the money sorted, then we figure it out. Renata, how long is that going to take, Colin? Not long. He'll do it if I ask right. 4 times I read through it. 4. Hunting each pass for the misunderstanding, I must have made the piece of context that would tilt it into something other than what it plainly was. It never came. The 4th reading landed the same as the first, the way it feels to press your hand against a wall you've leaned on your whole life and discover something has shifted beneath the plaster. He'll do it if I ask right. My knuckles whitened against the arms of the chair. It wasn't cold, that did. It wasn't age, it was something I'd been hauling in silence for months that had no proper word attached to it. Not anger, exactly, not grief, exactly. The territory between those two, scorched and hollow. I returned the phone to the counter, setting it at the precise angle I'd found it. Then I stood at that window above the sink and looked out at the yard. The pole beans along the south-facing wall that I'd put in back in May, bowing now under their own weight in the September heat. The fence gate I'd rehung on new hardware. The border of lawn I'd clipped clean with a neighbor's edger. I stood there thinking about what a man gives to a place that was never going to keep him. Then I heard Colin on the stairs. I turned the tap on and rinsed my mug shoulders to the room. My face had work to do, the kind of work a face is called on when the mind behind it needs to stay hidden. Colin came in. I heard him collect the phone from the counter, the quiet tap of him checking the screen, the soft sound of it going into his pocket. "Morning, Dad," he said. The same voice as always. Nothing different. Nothing off. I shut the water off and turned to face him. I looked at my son the way I'd looked at him that rainy night, carefully searching, hoping to find someone I still knew. I found him. That was the part I couldn't shake. He was standing right there. That's my son. My Colin. The little boy in dinosaur pajamas who used to climb onto a stool in my workshop and want to know why wood had a smell. All these years later, and he was standing right there in that same kitchen, 44 years old, looking at me like the world was exactly as it should be. No idea what I'd just read, no idea what was sitting in my chest. "Coffee's on," I told him. "Morning, son." He filled a mug, bent down to kiss Owen on the top of the head, as Renata came down the stairs carrying the baby and walked out the front door at 7:15. I stayed in that kitchen after he was gone, just stood there. The coffee went cold, and I didn't touch it. After a while, Remy crawled out from under the table and pushed his flank into my leg, that thing he does when something is off when he knows before I do. Yeah, I told him. My voice barely made it out, scraped down to almost nothing by everything I was keeping inside. I didn't fall apart. I want to say it was because I'm the kind of man who doesn't. But that wouldn't be the whole truth. What actually kept me upright was that I'd gone quiet somewhere deep the way a workshop goes quiet on an early morning before the first tool comes off the rack, when the lumber is still full of possibility, and you're standing there deciding what it's going to be. I climbed the stairs and went to my room. I lowered myself onto the edge of the mattress. Remy jumped up next to me. He reserved that for the moments when I truly needed it, and rested his old gray-muzzled head across my thighs. I kept my palm on his back and let his breathing do the talking. Even unhurried, honest. And for the first time since the day I'd arrived in Charlotte, I allowed the question I'd been walling off for months to come forward and stand in front of me. Had my son ever actually wanted me under his roof? Or had I just been the down payment? That answer lodged in my chest, the way a splinter does when it's gone in too deep for your fingers to work out. You know it's there. You can feel every movement around it. You just can't reach it. But I was beginning to try. 40 years at a workbench teaches you to read what hasn't shown itself yet. A hairline fracture in the grain that seems like nothing will tear the whole board open inside of 6 months if you walk past it. A joint that holds perfectly in July will start to give when the winter pulls the moisture out of the air. The wood tells you where it's headed, you just have to know how to look. After that September morning, I started reading Renata the same way I read Wood. What I found turned my stomach. It announced itself in small ways. First, the kind of thing you excuse once, twice, maybe a third time before you stop excusing it. Renata had gotten into the habit of taking certain calls out on the back deck. I'd clocked it before without thinking much of it. Now I started paying attention to the pattern. The calls came in clusters, 2, maybe 3 across a single week, then a gap of a few days, then another round. Always the same picture voice, low back to the house, one hand cutting the air, the way it did when she was holding her ground against someone. Late one afternoon in September, I was sitting at the kitchen table with a book when she came in from outside, phone still in her hand, and flipped her laptop open on the counter. She needed to check something fast. Owen started crying upstairs, and she left without closing the screen. I wasn't snooping. But that subject line was sitting there 3 feet away in type large enough that a man in reading glasses didn't need to move an inch. Property listing inquiry, Myers Park. The heat dropped out of my face like a stone going into water. She was back downstairs in less than 2 minutes with Owen on her hip. The moment she registered me sitting at that table, something crossed her expression, half a heartbeat, the kind you only catch if you've already been watching for it. Her gaze went to the laptop, then back to me. Then she walked over and eased it shut, unhurried, casual, as if she were simply clearing the counter. "How's Owen doing?" I asked. "Fine," she said, not a flicker in her voice. "Just needed his pacifier." She carried him off to the living room. I stayed at the table and stared at the wall while everything from the past 6 months quietly rearranged itself into something legible. Claudette Drury showed up 2 days after that. I'd been in Renata's mother's company exactly 3 times before. She was a small, put-together woman in her mid-60s. Hair dyed an auburn shade, her age couldn't back up jewelry that preceded her into every room she entered. She moved with the authority of someone who had long since concluded she outranked the company. She and Renata shared the same habit when they walked into a space, taking it apart with their eyes, measuring what wasn't working already, imagining it different. Colin was at the office that Saturday morning when she arrived. I was in the backyard with Remy and heard the front door open. Their voices drifted out through the screen. Claudette's carried the way it always did. "This kitchen's bigger than I was remembering," Claudette said. "We had the island pushed out last year," Renata told her. "Good thinking. Adds value." A beat of silence, then footsteps shifting toward the living room. "These ceilings, 9 feet 9.5. Then that sound from Claudette, the satisfied tick of someone checking a box. "The market's strong in this neighborhood right now, honey. It really is. A place like this, you don't want to hold it longer than you have to." I didn't move from my spot in the yard. Remy pressed into my knee while I stood there listening to Renata's mother tour my son's house, the house that my money had gone into, and size it up like something ready to be turned into cash. I know," Renata said, lower than her mother's voice, but no less certain. "I just need a little more time. There are things I still have to work through." "What kind of things?" Silence, 3 seconds, maybe 4. Enough to carry weight. "The situation upstairs." My back teeth ground together hard enough to ache. I was the situation upstairs. I took Remy to the far edge of the yard and stood near the fence, and I stayed there until I heard Claudette's car back out of the drive about an hour later. When I walked inside, Renata was at the kitchen counter feeding Owen. She looked over at me and offered a smile, bright, smooth, the kind that's been practiced until it shows nothing at all. "Eugene, I hope we weren't in your way. Mom just wanted to pop in." "Not a bit," I said. "Good to see her." I went upstairs. My legs carried me up those steps like they'd been packed with wet concrete. I sat down on the bed and ground the heels of my hands into my eyes until the pressure had something for me to hold on to besides the burning that was building under my ribs. She was putting the house on the market. I couldn't prove it yet, not with anything a lawyer could use. But I had 40 years of reading the hidden fractures in wood, the stress lines that don't announce themselves until the piece comes apart in your hands. And everything I had just heard and seen was telling me the same thing. The house my money had helped purchase was being lined up for a sale, and I was the last obstacle in the floor plan that had to be cleared before the listing could go up. I crossed to the valise. My hand went straight to the paper, didn't have to search. I drew it out and smoothed it open across my knee. His name at the bottom, Nadel's name underneath it, witness. The date in April, 47, $. And that one line I had written in at the end, the line he'd put his name to without reading it, to be repaid upon request. I folded it back the way it had been. This time it went into my shirt pocket. Not the valise. My shirt pocket where I could feel it. Close to me. I looked over at Remy on his bed across the room. His tail made one slow pass. "That piece of paper's going to matter, buddy," I said, keeping my voice low. He set his chin down on his front paws and held me in that gaze of his 10 years of soft brown eyes that had never told me anything but the truth. Through the window, a car moved past on the quiet Myers Park street. A single leaf let go from the tree outside and turned slowly on its way down. Autumn had arrived in earnest, and something inside me, something that had been waiting a long time, something that still had unfinished business, was beginning to stir. The first thing I noticed when I woke up was the silence, but not the kind that had lived in Colin's house, that coiled, watchful quiet, where you never quite knew what temper was waiting at the bottom of the stairs. This was something else entirely. Leonard's house held the silence of a place where nobody had anything left to prove. Gray morning light pushed softly through the curtains. Somewhere down the hall, a clock marked time. Remy was curled at the foot of the bed, and when I shifted, he raised his head and fixed me with those steady brown eyes, tail making one slow pass across the quilt. "We made it through the night," I told him. He set his chin back down, satisfied with that. I stayed flat for a few minutes, just breathing. My back ached the way it always did after a cold night, that deep, familiar grinding I'd long since accepted as the toll for 72 years of living. Through the window, I could hear Charlotte waking up outside a delivery truck somewhere down the block. The distant hum of traffic, a dog going at it 2 houses over. I was reaching for my phone on the nightstand when it rang right there in my hand. Nadel Picard. I answered before the second ring was through. "Nadel." Her voice came at me sharp and warm, together the voice of a woman who'd been awake for hours and had been working something out during all of them. "Eugene, how are you? Where are you?" "Leonard's place," I said. "I'm all right." A breath of relief came through the line, audible. "Good. Good. I've been up since 4 worrying about you, you stubborn old man." Despite everything that was sitting on my chest, something small and tight in there came loose at that. "You didn't need to lose sleep over me." "Well, I did. So that ship has sailed." A short pause. "Eugene, I need to tell you what happened last night. All of it. From the beginning." I worked myself up against the headboard and listened. Nadel had been visiting her niece, a young woman named Bet, who lived 2 doors down from Colin on the same Myers Park block, a fact she'd never mentioned when I moved in because it hadn't seemed relevant until last night. She'd been standing at Bet's front window when the porch light changed at Colin's house. She watched Colin open the front door. She watched him carry my suitcase out and set it down on the front walk. "When I saw everything, Eugene," she said, and her voice dropped half a register the way a voice does when someone is holding themselves carefully together. "I saw you pick up that suitcase. I saw you walk out into that rain with Remy. I saw that door shut behind you." My throat closed up. I turned toward the window and went very still, the way a man does when the wrong movement might shatter something he can't afford to break right now. "Eugene, I had my phone out before that door finished closing." Her voice went fierce and level, the voice of a woman who'd already decided and was daring anyone to push back. "I recorded it from Bet's front porch. You, the suitcase, Remy, the whole thing. Clear as day, even in the rain." I drew a slow breath. "You recorded it. Every second of it. And then I called Leonard because I knew you'd sit out on those steps all night before you'd ring a single person for help, and I wasn't about to stand there and let that happen." I rubbed my jaw with my free hand, stubble rasping under my palm. The delivery truck had moved further off down the street. Remy had repositioned himself at the foot of the bed and was watching me with his ears tipped slightly forward, reading everything he could from my side of the conversation. "I don't know what to say to you," I told her. "You don't have to say anything. Just listen." Another pause, and then her voice shifted, softer, more deliberate, the way she used to speak to me in those weeks right after Dorothy passed, when she'd appear at the door with food and never once make me talk about it. "Eugene, what do you want to do? Not what you think you ought to do. Not what's going to make things easier for Colin. What do you actually want?" Nobody had put that question to me in a very long time. It sat in my chest and slowly expanded the way green wood does when it finally gives up its tension. "I want what's fair," I said. The words came out quiet but solid, the way things do when you've been thinking them without realizing it. "Not revenge, Nadel. I don't want to burn anything down. I just want what's fair. I put 47,000 of my life's work into that house. Colin needs to understand you don't do what he did and walk away from it without consequence." Nadel was quiet for a beat, the thinking kind, not the empty kind. Then you need a lawyer, Eugene." And I think I know exactly who. I don't know the first thing about lawyers. You don't need to. You just need to walk in the door and tell the truth. A sound that was almost a laugh. You've been doing that your whole life. Shouldn't be too hard now. Her name is Adrienne Forsyth. Her office is downtown, looks out over the Catawba. She handled my cousin's property dispute 3 years ago, and she went at it like it was personal. Sharp as anything, and she doesn't suffer fools. A pause. I already called her this morning, Eugene. She can see you Thursday. Something ached in my chest that I couldn't name cleanly. Gratitude and grief wrapped around each other so tight, I couldn't tell them apart. This woman had lost sleep over me, had stood at a window in the rain with her phone out, had called Leonard and a lawyer before I'd even thought to call anyone. Nadell, I said, why do you always? Because Dorothy would have done the same for me, she said, simple, final, the kind of answer that closes a door gently enough that no one has to hear the click. I swallowed. My eyes burned in a way I hadn't permitted in years, that deep, hot pressure behind the bridge of my nose that I forced back with everything I had. All right, I managed. Thursday. Leonard knows where the office is. Her voice went gentle. And Eugene, eat something this morning. You sound like a man running on coffee and stubbornness. That's about right, I said. She laughed a real one, short and bright, and it was the best sound I'd heard since I walked out into that rain. After I hung up, I sat there with the phone in my lap and Remy watching me from across the quilt. I looked down at that old, gray, muzzled face that had never once let me down. Something settled in my bones the way timber finds its level after a long haul. We've got a name, buddy, I said. Adrienne Forsyth. Remy's tail swept the quilt once slow and deliberate like an old judge bringing down a gavel. Leonard's car smelled of leather and old coffee and a faint thread of sawdust. I was fairly sure it came from the blanket he kept folded on the back seat, the one he used to cushion finished pieces when he drove them out to clients. Some things about a man don't change no matter how far he's come. With Leonard, it had always been the sawdust. He drove me downtown on a Thursday morning in late October. The trees lining Providence Road had gone full amber, and rust leaves releasing in the dry breeze and skittering across the windshield like they had somewhere urgent to be. Charlotte in autumn carries a particular quality of light, gold-toned and faintly melancholy, like something beautiful that understands it won't last. I had my old blue suitcase in the back seat alongside Remy. Not because I needed everything inside it, but because the paper was in there, and I wasn't letting that paper out of my sight. Leonard pulled into the parking garage beneath a glass office building that looked out toward the Catawba River. He cut the engine and turned to me. You ready for this? I thought about it honestly. No, I said, but I'm going anyway. He nodded like that was exactly the right answer. I'll be in the lobby. Take as long as you need. Adrienne Forsyth's office was on the 14th floor. The elevator opened into a small waiting room with good furniture and a window that framed the Catawba like a painting, the river gray-green in the morning light. A barge moving slow and heavy downstream. A young assistant brought me straight in without making me wait, which I was grateful for. I had spent enough of my life waiting. Adrienne Forsyth was not what I expected. What I'm about to discover will rewrite everything I thought I understood about the people closest to me. Before that moment arrives, let me ask you something. If you found out someone you loved had been quietly working against you the whole time, would you confront them face to face? Or would you gather every piece of proof first and let the truth do the talking? My mental image had been of someone silver-haired and grandmotherly, the kind of person who makes you feel safe before she says a word. Adrienne Forsyth was nothing like that. Late 40s, dark hair, drawn back, neat reading glasses parked on top of her head, as if she'd set them there and moved on to something more urgent. The blazer was charcoal, the expression was concentrated, and the moment I stepped through her door, I had the distinct sense that she had already cleared everything else from her mind, and I was what remained. She came to her feet and extended her hand across the desk. The grip was quick and solid, no performance in it. "Mr. Hartwell." A gesture toward the chair. "Sit down, tell me everything, and don't leave anything out because you're worried how it reflects on you." I sat. The suitcase went on the chair beside me. Then I opened my mouth and didn't stop for close to 40 minutes. I gave her the whole of it, the April phone call that brought me to Charlotte, the sale of my land, the handwritten note I'd signed at the notary's, the text thread I'd read on Colin's phone at the kitchen counter, the subject line sitting open on Renata's laptop, Claudette moving through that house room by room, like a woman running numbers. Adrienne stayed forward in her chair the entire time, elbows on the desk, gaze on my face, not once lifting a hand to stop me. She listened the way a craftsman examines wood before the first cut, methodically turning each thing over, missing nothing. When I ran out of words, I reached into the suitcase and slid the paper across to her. She picked it up and read it slowly. Read it again. Something altered behind her eyes, not surprise, more like recognition, the particular look of someone whose hand has just closed around exactly what they were searching for. "Put Nadel Picard's signature as witness," she said. "She was present when Colin signed this. She was there. Her idea." "Mr. Hartwell, that is very good." She placed the paper on the desk with the deliberate care you use for things that matter. "How much total?" $47,000. She wrote it down, then swiveled to her computer and typed. Her eyes tracked across the screen for a moment, then she looked back at me. The glasses had worked themselves down from her head to the bridge of her nose without her seeming to notice. "May I call you Eugene?" I told her she could. "Eugene, the first thing I did this morning after Nadel reached me was pull the deed and mortgage records on the Myers Park property." She laced her fingers together on the desk. "Her name is on the original co-signer agreement, the one filed when the loan application went in. But approximately 4 months after the closing, someone filed an amendment to that agreement. Your name came off it. The tightness in my chest was immediate. Is that something they're allowed to do?" "Not without a signed authorization from you, which I'm going to assume does not exist. I never put my name to anything like that." "Then Colin or someone working on his behalf had you removed from that agreement, and you were never told." She gave that a moment of air. "Now I want to be honest with you about what this buys us. It doesn't make you an owner. Title sits in Colin and Renata's names, full stop. But it hands us a second breach of contract argument, and it makes your civil case substantially harder to knock down." I leaned in. "Walk me through the civil case." She reached for a pen, tapped it once on the notepad. "We bring suit in Mecklenburg County Superior Court. We put the promissory note in front of the judge, the one you wrote by hand. In this state, that document meets every threshold for a legally binding promissory note. Our argument is that Colin accepted $47,000 from you under a clear obligation to repay it on demand. We ask for that principal statutory interest on top and recovery of legal fees." She set the pen down. "But there is something else, and I need a straight answer from you before we take another step." "Go ahead." When Colin applied for that mortgage, federal disclosure requirements obligated him to identify where his down payment money came from. If he told the lender your $47,000 was a gift from family, which the promissory note proves it was not, then what he submitted was a false statement on a federally backed loan application. She held my gaze without blinking. "Eugene, that is mortgage fraud. That is a federal offense." The words occupied the room. I found myself looking at her desktop, the wood grain of it dark walnut well joined. I can't help but read a surface like that. What happens to Colin if that goes forward? I kept my voice quiet and level. An entirely separate process gets opened. Criminal exposure. The possibility of prosecution. She didn't look away. I'm going to ask you a question, and I want the gut answer, not the one you think sounds right. Are you trying to hurt your son, or are you trying to get what's fair? The answer had been living in my chest since the morning I stood at that kitchen counter reading those messages. I didn't have to fish for it. Justice, I said. That's all I want. Not prison, not ruin. I want him to reckon with what he did to me, to himself, to everything I spent my life building, so he could have something decent to stand on. My jaw was set, but my voice was even. Can we get there without touching the federal angle? Adrienne pulled a fresh legal pad toward her and uncapped the pen. That small, crisp click. Yes, she said. The mortgage fraud stays in our back pocket. Colin settles and honors the judgment, it never surfaces. He digs in or tries to obstruct. Then the conversation changes. She looked up. All right, Eugene. Let's get to work. I settled back into that chair, and something unknotted across my shoulders that had been pulled taut since September. Through the window at her back, the Catawba River moved on under a gray October sky, steady, indifferent, carrying everything with it downstream the way water always does. 72 years old, and I had never once sat across from a lawyer. But 40 years at the bench had taught me one thing above all others: the right tool in practiced hands can reveal what the wood was always meant to be. Adrienne Forsyth was the right tool. I was not finished yet. 2 weeks separated that first visit from the call that pulled me back. 2 weeks of mornings in Leonard's guest room and long afternoons walking Remy along the Little Sugar Creek Greenway, while Charlotte's last autumn leaves let go and spiraled down around us. 2 weeks of evenings in Leonard's workshop behind the house. He'd given me the run of the bench and the tools, and I used them the way other men reach for old photographs. Running my hands over wood, looking for something solid to hold. The call from Adrienne came on a Wednesday afternoon. Same 4 words as before, reshuffled. Eugene, I need you to come in. Leonard drove. Same parking structure, same elevator ride up. But when I stepped into Adrienne's office, the desk had been transformed. Folders, stacked, printed emails, spread document photographs, arrayed across the surface in a way that spoke of sustained, serious effort. She glanced up as I came through the door, and her face held something different than before. Not urgency, precision. The look of a surgeon who has everything laid out and knows exactly where to begin. She pointed to the chair. Sit down. We have more than I expected. I sat, hands flat on my thighs. How much more? Enough. I'll go in order. Stop me wherever something isn't clear. She opened the first folder to a printed document. A real estate listing agreement with Renata's signature running across the bottom. That looping cursive of hers, plain as day from where I was sitting. This is a listing agreement carrying Renata Hartwell's signature, Adrienne said. A licensed agency operating in the Myers Park market received it in August of this year. That is 2 months before the night you were put out of the house. She let me sit with that. Colin's name is nowhere on this document. I shifted forward in my chair. Can she list the property on her own without him? She cannot. Under the tenancy by the entirety statute, both title holders must sign any contract to sell or list. This document has one signature. It is not enforceable. She set it aside. But that isn't the point. The point is what it proves. Renata Hartwell was actively moving to put that property on the market 2 full months before the confrontation with you. What happened that night wasn't a reaction. It wasn't about muddy footprints or an argument that got out of hand. It was a scheduled step. The air felt different in the room after that. I held my jaw loose by habit. What else? Adrienne lifted the second folder open. Inside a printed email chain, multiple pages, the kind of back and forth that accumulates across weeks of planning. This is the correspondence between Renata and the listing agent, obtained through a formal discovery request. She rotated the top page toward me and drew one finger beneath a single line. I read it. The edges of my vision went soft for a second, and I had to blink them back into focus. The line read, "We're very close to being ready. Just need the old man's situation resolved first." "I know the old man's situation," I repeated. My voice came out flat as a plank. "That is how she described you to her real estate agent," Adrienne said. Her tone stayed professional, but something moved behind her eyes, controlled anger, held on a short leash. There was more in that chain. The listing agent had written back asking when they could expect to move forward. Renata's reply said she anticipated things being resolved within 4 to 6 weeks. 4 to 6 weeks. The same window as the rainy night in October when my suitcase ended up on the front walk. How did she find the agent? I needed to keep asking questions. Questions gave my hands something to do other than press through the surface of that walnut desk. Adrienne turned to the third page of the chain. The introduction had come by email. Renata's mother, Claudette Drury, had forwarded the agent's contact information with a short note attached. "This is the one I mentioned. He's discreet." She looked up. Discreet in this context appears to mean willing to proceed with an incomplete signature set, which is a licensing problem for the agent, but not our primary focus right now. I pressed my thumb and forefinger hard against my closed eyes until the pressure registered as light. Claudette. Claudette, who had strolled through that house room by room taking measurements with her eyes. Claudette, who had stood in the living room and told her daughter the market was strong and not to sit on it too long. Eugene. Adrienne's voice shifted. The steadiness stayed, but something softer moved into it. "Before we go further, I need to ask you something about Colin." I lowered my hands. "What is it?" "The listing agreement carries only Renata's signature. Colin is nowhere on that document. That tells me one of two things. Either he had no knowledge of it, or he made a deliberate choice not to have knowledge of it." She folded her hands on the desk. "Which do you believe?" The question reached somewhere deep. I thought about my son standing in the kitchen saying the word temporary. I thought about that text. "He'll do it if I ask, right?" I thought about the night he told me to go, how he wouldn't meet my eyes, how his gaze kept dropping to the floor as if holding my face in view, and carrying through with it at the same time was more than he could manage. "I think," I said slowly, "that Colin knew enough and chose not to look at the rest." My throat was heavy with it. He didn't engineer the whole thing, the phone calls, the real estate agent, that wasn't him. But he left the door open and let it walk in. I looked at Adrienne. "Does that distinction hold any weight in the civil case?" "Not much. Your claim runs against both of them as a household, but it matters for something beyond the courtroom." She held my gaze. "When this is behind you, if there's anything left to salvage between you and your son, he's going to need to face how much he chose not to see." I pushed up from the chair and went to the window. The Catawba was doing what it always does, running brown-green and steady, moving everything along without complaint. My own reflection hung faint in the glass, an old man in a flannel shirt standing in a lawyer's office trying to figure out how his life had arrived here. "She was going to sell the house I bought," I said. The words tasted like gravel. My money in the foundation and my son stood aside while she lined it up behind my back. I heard Adrian set her pen down behind me. Eugene. Her voice was careful. There's one more matter, and it concerns Colin's conduct specifically. I need you to let me finish before you say anything. I turned from the window. My chest was tight, my eyes were hot, and I was 72 years old, and apparently not yet finished discovering new ways to be hurt. Tell me, I said. She poured 2 cups of coffee before she settled back in her chair, sliding one across the desk toward me without making a question of it. I wrapped both hands around the mug, not for warmth, for something solid to hold on to. When Colin applied for the mortgage on the Myers Park property, she began. He completed a uniform residential loan application, the standard federal form every borrower in this country signs. One section of that form requires the borrower to identify where their down payment money came from. I kept my eyes on her. My hands stayed around the cup. Colin listed your $47,000 as a family gift, she said. Not a loan, a gift. I put the cup on the desk. But I have the paper. Exactly. You have a signed promissory note that states plainly the money was a loan repayable on demand, which means Colin filed a knowingly false statement on a federally backed mortgage application. She gave that one breath of space. That is mortgage fraud, Eugene. Under federal law, specifically 18 U.S.C. Paragraph 1014, making a false statement on an application to a federally insured institution is a criminal offense. It carries potential fines and imprisonment. The room went very still. Somewhere above the ceiling, the ventilation hummed. Outside, a cloud crossed the sun, and the light through the window went gray and flat, then opened up again. Why run it that way? My voice was controlled, but holding my jaw steady was costing me. Because if he disclosed it as a loan, the bank would have factored it as existing debt that reduces his debt-to-income ratio and could have disqualified him from the loan amount he needed. Adrian's voice carried the even neutrality of a physician walking you through a diagnosis. Calling it a gift kept his numbers clean. The bank approved him. He got the house. A pause. Your money is what made that possible. And he lied to a federal institution to make certain no one could ever come back and claim it. I stood up. My legs made the decision before I did. I went to the window again. That window had been doing a lot of work for me today. The Catawba was still moving out there, indifferent and unhurried, carrying everything downstream the way it always had. Water that just kept going, no matter what foolish things were done along its banks. Eugene. Adrian's voice came from behind me, quiet but definite. I need your answer before I take the next step. If I report this to the lender or to the FBI's mortgage fraud division, it opens a federal investigation. Colin could face criminal charges entirely separate from our civil action. A pause. That decision is yours, not mine. I turned around. There was a burning in my chest, the kind you get from swallowing something too hot, too fast. Not at Adrian. Not at the law. At the picture itself. At a 44-year-old man seated at a desk, filling out a federal form, writing the word gift over a line that should have said loan because it was easier and nobody would check. And the old man back in Rutherford County would never be any the wiser. No federal, I said. The words came down like a hammer finding the nail. I don't want my son in a federal courtroom. I don't want him anywhere near handcuffs. My voice broke on that last word, barely just a hairline fracture in it, enough to remind me there was still a father underneath everything else I was carrying. But I want it on the table. I want him to know that I know. And I want Adrian Forsyth to make certain that if he fights us, if he makes this ugly and drags it out, then we revisit. Adrian gave a single nod. Understood. It stays as leverage only and goes no further unless he forces it. She reached for a fresh legal pad. Then here is how we proceed. She walked me through it step by step, in the clear, ordered way I've always preferred things, the way a solid set of plans lays a build-out from foundation to roof. She would send a formal demand letter to Colin's home address and to his attorney of record if he had retained one. The letter would state the amount owed, 47,000 plus statutory interest accrued from the date of transfer and require repayment within 30 days. It would cite the promisor and Nadel Picard's witness signature and note the removal from the co-signer agreement without consent. It would not name mortgage fraud directly, but would state that additional matters had come to Adrian's attention and that she reserved the right to raise them before the court if necessary. Anyone with experience reading legal language would understand exactly what that sentence meant. 30 days, I said. And if he doesn't pay? We file in Mecklenburg County Superior Court. Discovery begins. Bank statements, the listing agreement, the full email chain. All of it enters the formal record. She looked at me over the top of her glasses. Colin is a financial analyst, Eugene. He knows from the inside what a discovery process looks like. He knows what happens once those documents start surfacing. The pen came sliding across the desk and I picked it up. 2 pages, the authorization form, clean lines, precise language, the kind of document a man could actually understand. Here is what you're committing to. Here are the limits. Here is what it all adds up to. I went through it line by line. Signing things blind was a lesson I'd already absorbed, even if I'd absorbed it secondhand, watching my son do exactly that. When I reached the bottom, I signed. My hand didn't shake. 72 years old, and the pen still felt right in my fingers. Leonard was downstairs in the lobby when I stepped off the elevator. He'd been staring at his phone, but he looked up the moment the doors parted. He read whatever was on my face and rose to his feet before I said a word. How'd it go? She's sending the letter, I told him. He took that in with a slow nod. We headed out to the car, side by side. The air hit us like something with teeth. November, cold. Rolling down out of the hills, the kind that carries wood smoke in it. The promise of a hard winter settling in. There was something in it that reminded me of Rutherford County. That night, Leonard unlocked the workshop for me. Back in the rack, I found a white oak board, dense, straight-grained, still holding the memory of the forest in its smell. I got it onto the bench, lifted the handplane and let myself begin. The first pass peeled a thin ribbon of wood off and sent it curling into the air. Then the second. The third. Before my thoughts had time to organize themselves, my shoulders had already found the old cadence, the pressure, the pitch, the instinctive read of the grain beneath the blade. The room filled up with the scent I'd breathed my whole working life, oak and fine dust and cold air and that deep, specific quiet that only comes when you give yourself over to one honest task, repeated, until everything rattling around inside your skull runs out of room. Remy was stretched out next to the bench muzzle, resting on his front paws, his breathing slow and regular. Across Charlotte somewhere a demand letter was taking shape with my name behind it, aimed squarely at my son's door. But in that little workshop on a cold November night, an old man drew his palm along a piece of oak and understood for the first time, in longer than he could say, that the work in front of him was straight and true, and that he was exactly where he belonged. Adrian's office sent the demand letter out on a Tuesday, certified mail addressed to the Myers Park house. She had filed the civil complaint with Mecklenburg County Superior Court that same morning, because Colin had not acknowledged her preliminary notice from the week before in any way whatsoever, And Adrienne Forsyth was simply not built to sit on her hands past a deadline she'd set herself. I figured the envelope would reach the door by Thursday at the outside. Nadell rang me Friday morning. I was on my feet at Leonard's kitchen window working through my second cup of coffee, watching a pair of cardinals taking turns at the feeder in the yard. Remy stood next to me, eyes tracking the birds, with the patient curiosity of an old dog alert, but unhurried the days of chasing anything long behind him. Eugene. There was a particular quality to Nadell's voice, a taut, careful sound, like someone who had just seen something they were still trying to sort through. It came yesterday. I spotted the mail carrier. I set the cup down. Tell me. I was at Bet's, still she'd asked me to stay on another week. And truthfully, I had no intention of leaving Charlotte before I could see how things were going to land. She paused. The truck showed up around 2:00 in the afternoon. Colin was home working from what I could tell. His car hadn't moved from the driveway. He came out himself to sign for the envelope. I kept my attention on the cardinals. What did he do? He tore into it right there on the porch, didn't even step back inside first. Nadell's voice was deliberate, controlled, like she was working from a mental log she'd kept while it unfolded. Eugene, I have watched a great many people get news they weren't ready for. The color drained out of his face, not little by little, but instantly, completely, as if someone had killed a light switch somewhere behind his eyes. My chest went tight. I pressed my free hand against the counter to steady myself. He stood there and read the whole thing through twice, Nadell went on. Then the door closed behind him. 5 minutes or so passed, and then Renata appeared at the front. She must have taken one look at his expression, because he put the letter into her hands. I stood there watching her go through it. Eugene, from where I was. I couldn't read her features well, but I could see her silhouette through the glass clearly enough. The instant she understood what she was reading, everything about her body changed. She stiffened, locked up from the neck down, visible from 2 houses away. There's something that happens to a person's frame when a blow lands that they weren't braced for. She spoke a few words to him, turned and went back inside, nothing more. Said something to Colin. I never caught what it was, and then she was gone. Claudette showed up within the hour I watched her car come to a stop out front. She stayed inside for 45 minutes. Then a pause on the line. When she left, her face said plenty. I nearly spoke up then, but Nadell wasn't done yet. Eugene, there's something I want you to see. Would you be able to come by Leonard's this afternoon? She came at 3:00, phone already in hand. We settled around Leonard's kitchen table, Remy on the floor between our chairs, his tail making slow sweeps across the tile. She pulled up the video she'd put out on a Charlotte community Facebook group 3 weeks back. I'd been aware she filmed it. I knew it had gone up, but I had never actually watched it. She extended the phone toward me across the table. I took it from her. 40 seconds, the whole clip. Filmed from Bet's front porch, rain coming down the image, slightly unsteady, the way handheld footage shot in the dark always is. But it was clear enough. Clear enough to make out the porch light above the door. Clear enough to see that door swing open. Clear enough to see a blue suitcase lowered onto the front walk. Clear enough to see an old man in a flannel shirt crouch and lift it by the handle. A dog tucked in close against his side. Rain falling across both of them, clear enough to see the door swing shut. I watched it through once. My throat constricted so I had to swallow 3 deliberate times before I could trust my breathing again. Behind my eyes, a burn came on fast and fierce, and I made no move to stop it. This time I let it well up, blinked it down, and didn't look away. That was me on that screen. The old man. 72 years old, out in the rain, with a suitcase and a dog and no particular place to go, and a door falling closed behind him, like the final punctuation on a sentence that had been building for years. How many people have seen it? My voice had some gravel in it. Last I checked, Nadell said her tone had gone soft, careful, a little over 80,000. I laid the phone on the table. She reached across and covered my hand with hers. It was warm, dry, solid. The hand of a woman who had put a husband in the ground, brought up 3 children, and never once failed to appear when the moment required it. It's all right, she told me. Let them watch. My phone buzzed against the table. Adrienne's name on the screen. I read what she'd written. Eugene Collins' colleagues are finding the video. His name turned up in the public court filing this morning as well. I'm receiving signals from his attorney that they're looking to negotiate. Do not take calls from Colin himself. Run everything through me. I went through it twice, then laid the phone face down. Then it rang. Even face down the screen glowed light bleeding out from under the edges. I flipped it over. Colin. The name sat there pulsing on with every ring. 3, 4. The way you look at something that once held all the weight in the world and now holds something else, not lighter, just different, with a new gravity to it. Nadell watched me without a word. She wasn't about to tell me what to do. That was who Nadell was. She believed a man had to find his own footing before he could step anywhere worth going. It rang a 5th time. Then silence. I turned it back over on the table face down. Not yet, I said. Quiet, but clear. Nadell gave one slow nod, the kind that means she understood and agreed. Remy lifted his head onto my knee, solid warm, and I kept my hand along his side and let his breathing work its way into me, easy and steady, while the afternoon settled back around the kitchen like it had never been disturbed. But out across Charlotte somewhere, my son had just cleared out his desk and walked away from his office to his car alone. I had no way of knowing that yet. Adrienne would tell me the next morning when she called. But something in me, that deep down part, the part that always knew how to feel for weakness in the wood before the crack opened up, had already begun to sense it. Adrienne rang on a Monday morning, first week of December. Through Leonard's kitchen window, Charlotte had finally let winter have its way. The trees lining the street were stripped bare, dark branches cut against a sky the color of tarnished pewter. And there was a chill in the air that went beyond temperature. The kind that works its way into old joints and doesn't leave. I'd been up since 5, same as always, but I hadn't made it out to the workshop. Something had held me at the kitchen table with my coffee waiting in that particular way. A man waits like that when he can feel a call coming and isn't sure he's ready to receive it. When the phone went off and Adrienne's name appeared, I had it to my ear before the second ring was through. Eugene. Her voice carried its usual measured quality, but something lived beneath the surface of it, not quite satisfaction. Something closer to the sound of a door swinging open that no one would ever shut again. It's happening. My hand tightened around the phone. Tell me. Colin was terminated from his position this morning. She let that sit for exactly 1 beat, long enough for the words to find their footing. His firm, a financial investment company in South End, runs an internal compliance team that tracks public court filings for employee names. Our civil complaint entered the public record when we filed it last week. They had it within 48 hours. I drew in a slow breath through my nose. My coffee had gone stone cold in the cup. I hadn't registered it until that second. The video also made its way through their offices, Adrienne went on. Colleagues had passed it around internally. Between that and the court filing, their compliance department launched an internal review. A pause. Colin was let go from Keystone Capital Group this morning. They cited violations of their public compliance and code of conduct policies. Once the civil filing became public record, that gave them sufficient grounds to act. Whatever they may have turned up on their own end, frankly, is beside the point for us. What matters is that this was their decision arrived at through public information. We never went to his employer. The court filing did that work by existing. They didn't even need the fraud charge, I said slowly. No, they operated under their own internal policy. It's cleaner that way for them and for us. We didn't set it off. We never reported him to his employer. The filing was part of the public record, and they discovered it themselves. Her voice was measured and exact. I want you to be clear on that, Eugene. We filed a legal civil complaint. What unfolded after that was the consequence of Colin's own conduct, not something we designed or directed. I understood she was right. My mind knew it. But there's a difference between knowing something with your mind and carrying it somewhere lower down. Right at that moment, what I was carrying felt like a stone laid across my chest. He cleared out his desk, I said. Not really asking. This morning, security walked him out, standard procedure in financial firms when someone is let go for compliance reasons. A breath. Eugene, are you all right? Leonard had come into the kitchen while I was still on the phone. He'd read something in my expression and stopped near the counter, not pressing in, not retreating, just present the way he'd always been. I looked across the kitchen at him, and he held my eyes with that steady, undemanding gaze of his. I'll be in touch if anything comes up, Adrian, I said. Thank you. I set the phone on the table. Then I got up, crossed to the back door, and walked out onto Leonard's rear porch. The cold came at me right away, sharp, and clarifying, the kind that strips everything down to what's actually there, whether you asked for that or not. I stood in my flannel shirt, hands on the porch railing, looking out at the bare tree line, and I thought about my son. Not the 44-year-old man who had stood in that hallway and told me to take my dog and leave. I thought about the boy, the one who used to climb up onto my workbench stool at 5 years old and fire questions at me he barely had words for yet. The one who wept when our first dog died and tried to bury it because he believed I'd tell him, Miller men don't cry. I had never said that. Not once. But the fear of it had lived in him anyway. The one who had driven out of Rutherford County with everything ahead of him and my life's savings at his back, like a hand pressed there in blessing. My eyes burned. I let them. The cold air pulled the heat right out. Leonard came through the door behind me. He took up a spot at the railing alongside me, shoulder to shoulder, both of us looking out at those same stripped trees. He lost his job, I said. The words scraped out low and rough. Yes, Leonard said. I never wanted that for him. I know you didn't. I bore down on the railing. The wood was cold against my palms, painted porch lumber, nothing special, not what I'd have chosen, but solid enough to grip. All I ever wanted was for him to understand. That's all it ever was. I wanted him to look at what he'd done and actually see it. Leonard turned his head slightly in my direction. Eugene, just barely above a whisper. You filed a legal document. Everything that followed the job, the public record, the video, none of that is something you did to him. That's what his own choices constructed. Brick by brick over a long stretch of time. You just stopped standing in front of it. I held my eyes on the tree line for a long beat. A crow dropped onto the highest branch of the far oak and perched there, black against the gray, peering down at whatever it is crows concern themselves with. I keep seeing him at 8 years old, I said. My voice split right down the center, and I let it. Sitting on that stool in my shop, asking me why cherrywood smells like his grandmother's kitchen, something rose in my throat. Not quite a laugh, not quite a sob, somewhere between the two, occupying the space where neither one quite fits. How does a boy like that arrive at a place like this? Leonard was quiet for a moment. Then, the same way most of them do, Eugene, one small choice at a time. One thing they convinced themselves was fine when it wasn't. One door they stepped through without looking back. He laid his hand on my shoulder, brief and firm. That's not something you put on yourself. I dragged the back of my hand across my face. Remy had nosed the back door open and come out to stand beside me, his warm weight pressing into my leg. I reached down and settled my hand on top of his head. "There's more ahead, isn't there?" I said. It wasn't really a question. "There usually is," Leonard said. "But you've got solid people around you. And you've got that dog." I almost smiled. Almost. Back inside, I emptied out the cold pot and started a fresh one. Outside, Charlotte's first December sky pressed down gray and still, and the bare trees stood in it, the way old things do, the way things that have weathered hardest seasons learn to simply hold their ground. The last thing Leonard said to me that evening, as I set my chisel down and watched the sawdust drift and settle across the workbench floor, was this: "Eugene, sometimes a man has to lose everything before he can see what he was actually holding." I didn't come back at him right away. I just picked up a rag, worked it slowly over my hands, and let my thoughts go to my son. 3 days had gone by since Adrian called to tell me Colin had been let go from Keystone Capital Group. 3 days of stillness, no calls, no messages, not even a word from Nadell reporting his car in the neighborhood. Just silence, the dense, airless kind that pools in before something large gives way. It gave way on a Thursday morning. My phone buzzed on the nightstand at 7. Colin's name was on the screen, and my heart did something it hadn't managed in weeks. It lurched upward like a hand reaching for a rope. It wasn't certain would bear the weight. I answered on the second ring. "Dad." The word broke right across the middle as it came out of him. Just that one word, and I could hear 3 months of strain and shame and sleepless nights packed into those 3 letters. "I'm here," I told him, easing myself upright, my back pulling the way it always does when the cold has settled in overnight. "She's gone." His breath arrived in short, ragged catches. "Renata, she packed Owen's things last night while I was in the shower. When I came out, the suitcases were already by the door. I asked her what she was doing, and she said," his voice fractured further, "she said she didn't sign up to go down with a sinking ship." I pressed my palm flat to my chest, feeling the knock of my own heart against it. Lord have mercy. "Where did she go?" I asked, keeping my voice level and steady for him, the way you hold a light still, so someone else can find their footing. "Her mother's place. Claudette's." He gave a short laugh, hollow, stripped of anything resembling amusement. "You know what's funny, Dad? Claudette never liked me. Ever since the day Renata's mother first laid eyes on me. She'd carried herself like I was an inconvenience she'd been forced to accommodate. And now Renata was taking my grandson straight back to her." "Owen belongs to her just as much," I said gently, because that was the truth. And right then, Colin needed something true to hold on to. "I know that." His voice fell to barely a whisper. "I know." I went into his room this morning, and his stuffed bear was still sitting there on the bed. She didn't take it. She left Bruno behind. A sound tore out of him, ragged and broken. I understood it wasn't the toy he was grieving. It was all of it, every piece of it at once. My grip on the phone went tight. My own eyes were burning, but I held myself together. "Chonamai," I said after giving him a moment. "Are you all right? Is there anything in that house to eat?" "Half a bottle of whiskey and some crackers," he said. "Son, that's not a meal. That's a one-way road somewhere worse." I pushed myself to the edge of the bed feet, dropping to the cold floor. "I need you to call your doctor today. Not first thing tomorrow. Today." "No, this isn't a request." The words came out harder than I'd planned, but they needed to land. "You are my son. I am not going to sit back and watch you go to pieces without at least putting a hand out. Get yourself to a doctor, put some real food in, you get dressed." Silence stretched on the line. Then why are you being this way to me? Why are you being kind? That stopped me cold. Almost all the way. I felt the clench in my jaw, felt grief and fury come surging up together, the way floodwater comes fast and all at once. I pushed it back down. Because you're my blood, I told him quietly. That's not something that switches off when things fall apart. What came out of him then wasn't controlled. It wasn't the kind of crying a man does when he's trying to hold on to his dignity. It was the kind that lives below all that, the full-body, uncensored kind that breaks straight through every wall a person has spent years putting up. I kept the phone to my ear. I didn't feed him reassurances. I didn't promise him anything I couldn't guarantee. I just didn't leave. When the worst of it passed, I heard him pull a long, uneven breath. "I'm sorry, Dad," he said, barely above a murmur. "I'm so sorry." I held my gaze on the wall of Leonard's guest room. A cardinal, almost shockingly red against that flat, gray December sky, had come to rest on the fence post outside the window. Head cocked to one side as if it had something to consider. "I believe you," I said. And I did. But I also understood that being sorry and settling a debt are two separate matters. They have always been separate matters. 40 years of woodworking taught me that much. Drive a nail in at the wrong angle and split the plank. You can apologize to the wood all you want, it won't close the crack. The only thing that closes it is going back and doing the work right. The court date is next week, I told him. He deserved to know it was on its way. Adrienne will be in that room. So will I. He pulled a sharp breath. "Dad, Colin, I didn't file that suit to cause you pain. I filed it because what was done was wrong. Those are not the same thing, and I need you to sit with that." He offered no argument. Perhaps he'd run out of them. Or perhaps for the first time in a good long while, Renata's voice had gone quiet enough in his head that he could hear something else. Nadell phoned me that afternoon. She'd come past the Myers Park house that morning and found a moving van sitting along the curb. Two men in gray uniforms were hauling things out, a dresser, a child's bookshelf, towers of packed boxes. "She doesn't let grass grow under her feet," Nadell said, and her voice had the precise edge of a woman who has been close enough to betrayal to know its particular rhythm. "No," I said, watching Remy ease himself down at my feet, his old golden tail making slow passes across the hardwood floor. "She never has." Later that evening, I settled into Leonard's armchair. Remy's head weighted across my lap, a cup of tea sitting cold and forgotten on the side table. My mind kept going to Colin alone in that big, hushed house, Owen's stuffed bear abandoned on the mattress. I kept thinking about what it means to spend a lifetime building things, a family, a reputation, a picture of yourself, and to never see how fragile the whole structure is until the moment it comes apart. I worked my fingers behind Remy's ear, and he exhaled, deep, slow, satisfied. Next week, I kept thinking. The hearing. 72 years on this earth, and I have walked through a fair number of buildings. Tobacco warehouses in Rutherford County that held the smell of cured leaf and old timber in their walls. Hospital hallways running under cold fluorescent light, quiet in the particular way that frightened places are quiet. Sanctuaries where the air seemed to press down and make you lower your voice without being told. But I had never once set foot inside a courtroom until the morning of December 19th, 2024. Mecklenburg County Superior Court rises in downtown Charlotte in pale stone with tall windows that make no effort to look like anything other than what it is. Something about that kind of building, the ceilings climbing too high, every footfall ringing clean off the marble, puts a man in his proper proportion and sharpens him at the same time. Adrienne was waiting at the front steps at 8:15, briefcase in hand, a well-worn piece of leather that had clearly seen the inside of many such rooms before this one. Her grip when she shook my hand was firm. Her eyes behind the wire-rimmed glasses were calm and focused. "How are you holding up?" "Like a man with no business being here," I told her. A small, precise smile crossed her face. "You have every right to be here, the same right the truth has to be here. And today, the truth comes with thorough documentation." She gave the briefcase a pat. "Let's go in." Leonard had driven me. He took a seat toward the back of the courtroom, hands rested in his lap, chin just slightly raised, the posture of a man who has nothing to hide and no intention of pretending otherwise. Before I turned to sit down beside Adrian, I looked back at him. He gave me one nod. Steady. Certain. "I'm here." Colin came through the door 7 minutes behind us. He had on a charcoal suit that bore the signs of a man who'd dropped weight since it was fitted, the fabric sitting wide at the shoulders, the collar loose at the neck. His face told the story of too many sleepless nights, the skin below his eyes bruised with exhaustion. He took the seat at the opposing table without raising his eyes to anyone in the room, not to me, not to the gallery, not to the judge. Beside him sat his attorney, a man Adrian would later identify as Spencer Drummond. Drummond was the kind of polished that comes with practice gold cufflinks, posture arranged to communicate ease, a voice calibrated to sound level-headed, regardless of what the record showed. His opening position was that the $47,000 Eugene had given his son was a gift freely offered, a father's gesture of support, and that no enforceable obligation to repay it had ever been established. Adrian didn't move a muscle. She rose, gave her jacket one small, deliberate tug at the hem, and addressed the bench. "Your Honor, the plaintiff holds a promissory note carrying the defendant's signature dated April 14, 2024, witnessed by Nadell Picard of Rutherford County, North Carolina. The note identifies the principal as $47,000. It states the purpose, a down payment on the residential property at 312 Selwyn Avenue, Charlotte, and sets the repayment condition as follows: to be repaid in full upon demand or upon sale of the property, whichever occurs first. This instrument is not a gift. It is a documented, witnessed, legally binding loan." She placed the note on the clerk's desk with the calm of someone who has been holding the right card all along and has simply been waiting for the moment to show it. Judge Harold Paxton was a heavy-set man in his late 60s, reading glasses riding low on his nose, with the look of someone who stopped being surprised by human nature a long time ago. He took his time with the promissory note, turned the page, traced Colin's signature with one finger. "Mr. Drummond, take another run at it." "Your Honor, the language of the document is open to interpretation." "Mr. Drummond?" Judge Paxton looked up over the top of his glasses. "The document reads to be repaid in full upon demand. A demand letter went out by certified mail on November 28th. The defendant let the 30-day window close without a response. I'm not finding any ambiguity in that language." My hands were shaking where they rested against my thighs. I pressed them down flat and kept still. Adrienne pressed forward. She laid out the bank statement, the exact $47,000 transfer out of Eugene's account. The proceeds from the Rutherford County land sale deposited into Colin's personal checking account on April 15th, the day after the note was executed. Then she produced the mortgage application for 312 Selwyn Avenue, in which Colin had declared that same $47,000 to be a personal gift rather than a loan. She laid it out for Judge Paxton in plain, unhurried language, representing a loan as a gift on a residential mortgage application constitutes a material misstatement under federal lending guidelines, a matter she had reserved the right to refer to the appropriate authorities separately should the defendant fail to satisfy the judgment handed down today. At that, Colin's jaw went visibly tight. His attorney bent close and murmured something in an urgent undertone. Colin gave a short, stiff shake of his head. Furthermore, the plaintiff had been named as a co-guarantor in a letter submitted to the lender at the time of the original application, the document that helped establish the down payment funds as legitimate. His name was quietly removed from that letter approximately 6 weeks after closing through a filing process, without his written acknowledgement. That removal run through the lender's administrative channel without notice constitutes a breach of good faith in the underlying transaction and demonstrates the defendant's deliberate effort to erase the plaintiff's documented standing. The courtroom had gone very still. I could make out the ventilation system working somewhere above the ceiling tiles. Leonard's presence held steady somewhere in the rows behind me. I fixed my eyes on the wood grain of the table in front of me and kept breathing. Judge Paxton set his reading glasses down and directed his gaze at Colin across the room. "Mr. Hartwell," he said, and the tone was not cruel, but it left no room. "Do you dispute that the promissory note is authentic?" Colin's throat moved. He dropped his eyes to the table for a beat, then brought them back up to the judge. "No, Your Honor," he said. His voice came out barely above a murmur. "I don't." Spencer Drummond closed his eyes for just a moment the way a man does when he feels a door shut and knows he can't reopen it. Judge Paxton found in my favor. Judgment for the plaintiff, $47,000 in principal plus statutory interest at the applicable rate running from the date of demand, November 28, 2024, and partial attorney's fees. Colin had 90 days to satisfy the judgment, or Adrian could move to enforce it by way of wage garnishment, property liens, or forced sale. When the gavel came down, the sound traveled through me the way a low organ note fills a church, not triumphant, not joyful, but final. The way a closing hymn lands like something that needed naming has been named and can now be set down. I turned toward Adrian. My eyes were burning. I pressed my lips together and nodded because actual words were somewhere out of reach just then. She rested her hand briefly on my arm. "You did good, Eugene." Out in the hallway, the marble floor sent every footstep back at us doubled, and the tall windows poured gray winter light across everything and everyone. I glanced back toward the courtroom doors. Colin came through them a moment later, Spencer Drummond close at his side, speaking low and with some urgency. Colin wasn't taking it in. He stopped in the middle of that corridor, people streaming past on both sides, and he looked at me. Just looked. There was something in his face I hadn't seen in a long time. Something stripped down, unguarded, undefended. Something that looked underneath all the damage like the boy who used to drift off against the truck window on the drive home from Little League. Leonard appeared at my shoulder and put a hand there, warm and steadying. "You ready to go?" I took one last look at my son standing there under the flat fluorescent light, and it fell across him hard and honest, the way light sometimes does. "Yeah," I said quietly. "I'm ready." But as I turned to leave, I already knew the way you know weather is shifting before the clouds arrive. By the way the air changes, that this was not the end between Colin and me. The judgment was on the books. The court had done what courts can do. What came after that was something no ruling in the world has jurisdiction over. He came on a Tuesday afternoon, 4 days out from Christmas. I heard the knock from the kitchen, where I was working a piece of sandpaper along the edge of a small oak side table Leonard had asked me to finish. 3 knocks, deliberate but with something uncertain underneath them. The knock of a man who isn't sure he has standing to be at that door at all. I set the sandpaper down. A familiar tightness moved through my chest. Remy heard it too. He raised his big golden head up off his paws, ears forward, and put out a single quiet sound, not a bark, not a growl, something lower and older, than either a note of recognition coming from somewhere deep in his chest. Then he was moving, heading for the front door, faster than I'd seen him move in a good while, his whole hindquarters swinging with the effort. I went after him. When I pulled the door open, Colin was on the porch steps with both hands buried in the pockets of a gray jacket too thin for December. He'd shed more weight since the courthouse. His face was drawn in the cheekbones, sharper, the lines around his eyes belonging more to a man of 55 than one of 44. But his eyes were different. Gone was the flat-shuttered look he'd worn in that courthouse hallway. What was there now was clear, open, the way a room feels when you finally raise the window after a long, sealed winter. Before a single word had a chance to leave my mouth, Remy shoved past my leg and drove his nose straight into Colin's knee. Whatever composure Colin had brought with him came apart on the spot. His face buckled, and he went down to one knee right there on the steps, both arms going around Remy's neck, his face pressed into that old golden coat. His shoulders shook. He wept the way a man weeps when he's been carrying something beyond his strength for far too long. Not quietly, not with any pretense of control, but from a depth that moved through his whole frame. My own eyes burned so hard I had to take hold of the doorframe to keep myself upright. "He doesn't hold it against you," I said, my voice rougher than I'd intended. Colin pulled back just enough to look up at me. His face was wet, his eyes raw and reddened. "He should," Colin said, his voice threaded thin. "After what I did, what we did, he should." "Dogs aren't built that way," I said. "Neither is God, from what I've been told." I pushed the screen door open wider. "Come in out of the cold." He got to his feet slowly, one hand trailing along Remy's back, like he needed the contact to find his balance. He followed me inside without a word. I poured 2 cups of coffee, black strong the way Dorothy always made it, and put them on Leonard's kitchen table. Colin wrapped both hands around his mug and stared into it the way a man stares into something he's still trying to read. "I'm not here to contest the judgment," he said quietly. "I know that," I said, "and I'm not here to ask you to walk any of it back. Adrienne made it clear there's nothing left to negotiate." He let out a slow breath. I came because his voice broke across the middle of it. He pressed his lips tight, his jaw working through whatever was backed up behind them. "I came because I need you to know that I understand what I did. Not the legal part, not just the money. I know what I did to you as a man, as my father." Something in my chest began to shift, some deep, long-held tightness, starting very slowly to give. "Renata made it simple," he went on, and his voice took on a harder quality, now the edge of someone honest enough to stop sheltering behind excuses even while he's laying them out. "She made it easy to convince myself you'd see it our way, that you'd want this for us, that it wasn't really a loan, it was family, and family doesn't run on receipts." He shook his head, his face tightening with something that looked like contempt turned inward. "But I knew better. I knew that the night you signed the note. I understood what that land meant, the last ground your mother ever walked, and I took it from you anyway." Dorothy's name landing in the room hit me the way a palm pressed flat on a bruise hits sudden and deep. My throat pulled tight. I drew a slow breath through my nose and set my cup down with care. "Do you want to know what hurt me most?" I said. "It wasn't the money. I've known what it is to work without money. A man with my background knows that particular territory well. It wasn't the house or the land even. It was the night you put that suitcase in my hand. I met his eyes and held them because I needed every word to reach him. You handed me that suitcase and told me to take my dog and go. And the way you said it, I was a stranger to you. Like 72 years of living, 40 years of giving everything, I had a whole life spent loving you like none of it had ever been real." Colin's face came apart. He covered his mouth with one hand, His body shook with it, the tears arriving without decorum, without restraint, and he made no move to check them. He sat at that kitchen table and let go of everything he'd been holding since the whole thing began. And Remy, who had settled himself at Colin's feet the moment we sat down, laid his chin across Colin's shoe and went very still. I let him have it out. I didn't move him along. I didn't tell him it was all right. When he finally brought his head up, dragging the back of his hand across his face, I leaned forward and said it plainly and without hesitation, "I forgive you, Colin. I want you to hear that. I forgive you because you're my son, and because hate is a burden I've got neither the years nor the energy left to carry." I held his gaze a moment longer. But understand, this forgiveness and forgetting are not the same thing. Forgiveness doesn't erase what happened or pretend it away. The judgment holds. The debt is real. And if you want something genuine between us going forward, we build it from the ground up on honesty. No bypassing the hard parts. No false fronts. His chin trembled as he nodded. "I know," he whispered. "I know, Dad. I don't know whether you'll ever be able to trust me again." I reached over and put my hand on top of his. My old carpenter's hand, rough-scarred, worn down by decades of work. And I told him, "That's something you earn back. It's not something I hand over." He stayed close to an hour. We didn't untangle everything. We didn't put everything right. But when he walked out into the late afternoon and paused at the end of the driveway to look back, I lifted my hand. He lifted his. It wasn't a resolution. It was the first step toward one. January arrived quietly that year. Not the crushing silence of that October night, a suitcase, a dog, maybe $35 in my shirt pocket, and a phone with 8% battery. The other kind of quiet. The kind that carries the scent of cold pine and wood smoke. The kind a man only finds after the worst of the storm has moved through. Leonard's workshop had become mine in every real sense. He gave me the corner beside the wide, south-facing window, the best morning light in the place, and told me it was mine for as long as I had use for it. I'd taken on a rocking chair. White oak hand joinery, not a nail in it, the way my grandfather put things together back before I was even tall enough to clear a workbench. No particular person in mind for it when I started, which is, in my experience, the freest a craftsman ever gets to be. Remy slept in a patch of winter sunlight on the floor, his old golden coat rising and falling like something peaceful that had always been there and always would be. Nadel came by on Wednesday morning carrying a tin of lemon tea cakes and the expression of a woman who is sitting on news and ready to let it out. "Adrienne called me," she said, settling into the spare chair beside my bench. Colin made his first payment toward the judgment. On time. Full installment. I kept the hand plane working along the grain. "Good," I said. Nadel raised an eyebrow. "That's all you've got?" I glanced up and something tugged at the corner of my mouth. Not quite a smile, but in the neighborhood. Nadel, a man can only sustain so many large emotions before his heart starts putting in for early retirement. She laughed, genuine full, and Remy's tail knocked twice against the floorboards without him so much as cracking an eye. Pastor Dale came by that afternoon. Thinner than I'd carried him in my memory, moving with the deliberate care of a man who has learned to pay attention to what his body tells him. He stood in the doorway for a moment, taking stock, the tools along the wall, the wood shavings across the floor, the half-built chair gathering pale winter light. "You look like yourself again," he said simply. We drank coffee. He asked about Colin. I walked him through the visit before Christmas. The porch steps, Remy pushing his nose into Colin's knee, the kitchen table, the tears that neither of us tried to hold back. Like setting something heavy down, I told him. "My arms can rest now." Pastor Dale turned his mug slowly in his hands. The hardest thing about loving someone is letting them stand in front of what they've brought on themselves. You did that, Eugene. Most men never manage it. My eyes burned. I fixed my gaze on the grain of the workbench until it passed. After he left, I went back to his chair. Remy patted over and settled his warm weight against my leg, trusting total without a single condition, the way he has been every day for 10 years. I thought about Dorothy, about the land, about a boy running barefoot across a North Carolina yard, hollering my name before supper. Love doesn't vanish when it gets hurt. It goes underground instead, like roots in a hard freeze, biding time until the earth gives a little. Outside Leonard's window, the January sky stretched clear and cold and wide, the kind that makes you no promises but holds everything beneath it regardless. I thought that was more than enough. If this whole stretch of living has taught me anything, the land sale, the suitcase, the rain, the courtroom, the rocking chair, it's that love without limits isn't really love. It's a slow habit of erasing yourself until there's nothing left to offer. I used to think a good father pours everything out and takes nothing back. I had that wrong. A good father gives, honestly, speaks clearly, and trusts the people he loves to be sturdy enough for the truth. I should have said something sooner. Should have been plain about it. This is a loan, and I expect it to be honored, not because I needed the money returned, but because respect gets made in the small, honest moments, long before the large ones arrive to break you. Don't follow the path I took. Don't let love render you invisible. Don't hand over the last piece of ground your wife ever walked and call it a gift when every part of you knows it isn't. The Bible says the truth will set you free. If you've stayed with me this far, I want to thank you. Truly. This kind of story doesn't get easy to tell, even with years of distance between you and the worst of it. What this season of my life cost me was real. It cost me a home, a sense of safety, and a long stretch of nights wondering how a man raises a son and still ends up standing in the rain with a suitcase and a dog. But I believe God doesn't waste the hard things. The Lord's timing put the right people beside me, Leonard, Nadell, Adrienne, at exactly the moments I needed them most. And the reckoning that followed wasn't something I engineered. It was the natural consequence of truth finally being allowed to stand on its own 2 feet. So here is what I'd want you to take from all of it. Set clear terms from the start, even with family. A handshake and good intentions are not a foundation. Put it in writing and mean it. Don't let love make you invisible. Giving without boundaries isn't generosity. It's a slow, disappearing act that leaves everyone worse off. When someone shows you who they are, believe the evidence, not the story you've been telling yourself about who you hoped they'd be. And if you're in the middle of a family justice battle right now, if you're the one who has been cheated, dismissed, or cast aside, know that the truth has a way of surfacing on its own. You don't have to carry it alone. These dad's revenge stories resonate because they're not really about revenge at all. They're about a man refusing to disappear quietly. They're about self-respect. They're about what it means to love someone honestly, even when it hurts. If this story reached you today, leave a comment below and tell me what stayed with you. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you haven't already subscribed to Wise Revenge, there are more stories where this one came from. Thank you for being here. Take good care of yourself.